Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Australia, midnight in Washington, afternoon in Canada, or evening in England, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The silence after she said it was louder than any gunshot the territory had ever heard. 40 men stood in a line under the August sun in Crow Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1883. Ranchers, cattlemen, soldiers, sons of senators, each one dressed in their best, each one certain they'd be chosen. The choosing was the oldest tradition in the Arapahe family. When the eldest daughter turned 21, she stood before the suitors her father had approved and selected a husband. It was not a proposal. It was a verdict. And Sable Arapahe, standing on the porch of her father's ranch house in a white cotton dress with turquoise beadwork at the collar, her black hair unbraided, and falling past her waist for the only time in her life, looked at every single one of them, and rejected them all. She walked the line slowly. 40 men. The first was the son of a territorial judge, broad-shouldered, blond, the kind of man who entered rooms expecting them to rearrange around him. Sable stopped in front of him. He smiled. She shook her head and moved on. The second was a cattle baron's heir from Cheyenne, dark-eyed, confident, land-rich. She didn't even stop. The third, fourth, fifth. Ranchers, soldiers, a doctor from Laramie. She passed them the way wind passes through a fence. By the 20th rejection, the crowd was murmuring. By the 30th, her father, Magnus Arapahe, a mountain of a man, half Norwegian, half Arapaho, with silver hair braided tight and a face that had never shown surprise, was gripping the porch rail hard enough to whiten his knuckles. By the 40th, the line was finished. Every man rejected. The crowd was stunned. Then Sable turned. Not toward the house. Not toward her father. She turned toward the road that led into Crow Hollow from the south, where dust still hung from the last arriving riders. And she pointed. Not at the line. Past it. At a man on a horse who hadn't been invited, hadn't dismounted, hadn't even stopped. He was passing through. A stranger. Sitting on a buckskin mare at the edge of the road, watching the spectacle the way a man watches a parade in a town he doesn't belong to, with interest and no intention of joining. Sable pointed at him and said, loud enough for every person in Crow Hollow to hear, "I want him." The stranger's name was Cillian Vane. He was 27, lean as a whip, with sun-darkened white skin, sharp blue eyes that sat too deep in his skull, and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw like a river on a map leading nowhere good. He wore a faded denim shirt, a leather vest with no buttons, a hat the color of smoke, and boots that had walked more miles than most horses. He had no land, no family, no money beyond what filled his saddlebag. He was a drifter. He looked at Sable. He looked at the 40 rejected men. He looked at Magnus, whose face had finally found surprise. And he said the only honest thing a man in his position could say, "Ma'am, I think you've made a mistake." "I don't make mistakes," Sable said. The crowd erupted. The rejected suitors stared. Magnus's knuckles went from white to bloodless, and Cillian Vane, a man who had spent 27 years being nobody to everyone, sat on his horse at the edge of a road in a town he'd never planned to stop in, and realized that a woman he'd never met had just chosen him for a life he'd never imagined. The first man in the line, Harlan Goss, the judge's son, stood with his smile frozen and his hands curling into fists at his sides. He'd been certain. He'd been promised, or so he believed. And the rejection, public, absolute, for a stranger with nothing, landed on him like a brand. He didn't leave. None of them left, because men who've been passed over for a stranger don't leave. They wait, they plan, and they sharpen. The story people told afterward was simple. Sable Arapahe was wild, impulsive, a woman who rejected 40 good men for a drifter out of spite or madness. That was the story the rejected suitors carried to their territories. That was the story the newspapers in Cheyenne printed under headlines calling her the mad daughter of Crow Hollow. But stories told by humiliated men are never true, their revenge dressed as narrative. The real story began 6 months before the choosing, in a room above a dry goods store in Casper, where Sable watched her mother die. Ailani Arapahe had been full Arapaho, dark-eyed, quiet, the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself but waits in the room like a lamp someone forgot to light. She married Magnus at 19. He was 20 years older, Norwegian-born, a rancher who'd built Crow Hollow from nothing, and who loved Ailani the way a river loves its banks, completely, constantly, and with the understanding that without her he had no shape. But Magnus was not a cruel man. He was a controlling one. He decided what the daughters wore, who they spoke to, where they rode. He called it protection. Ailani called it nothing, because naming the cage doesn't open the door. Ailani got sick in the winter of 1882, tuberculosis. By spring, she was coughing blood. In her last week, she called Sable to the room above the dry goods store. Sable held her mother's hand, light as paper, thin as thread. Ailani said, "Your father will make the choosing for you. He'll fill the line with men he's chosen, men who will do what he says, men who will keep you the way he kept me." She paused, coughed, continued. "Choose someone he hasn't picked. Choose someone who has nothing to offer except himself, because a man who brings nothing can't hold anything over you. That's the only freedom this territory will give you. Little bird, take it." Sable buried those words the way you bury a seed, deep enough to survive the winter. 6 months later, standing on the porch in the white dress with turquoise beadwork her mother had stitched before her hands got too weak, Sable looked at 40 men her father had approved and saw 40 versions of her mother's cage. Different names, same bars. Then she turned and saw a stranger on a buckskin mare with no land, no name, no leverage, and a scar that said he'd survived something he didn't want to talk about. A man who had nothing, a man who could hold nothing over her. Her mother's voice said, "Him," and Sable pointed. She didn't tell Cillian any of this, not yet. What she told him that first evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while Magnus glared from the porch and the rejected suitors drank in the saloon plotting their grievances, was simpler. "I chose you because you were the only person at my choosing who wasn't trying to be chosen." Cillian looked at her. "That's because I was riding through." "Exactly. Every man in that line wanted something from me. Land, status, my father's approval. You wanted nothing. And a woman who's been wanted her whole life by men who want what she comes with. You have no idea how rare it is to be looked at by someone who wants nothing." Cillian was quiet a long time. "I want dinner," he said. Sable laughed, the first real laugh since her mother died. And Cillian, hearing it, thought, "That's the best sound I've ever caused." And that thought terrified him more than any scar. The memory came to Cillian at night, the way it always did, not as a story he could tell, but as a room he walked back into every time he closed his eyes. The Bowery, 1876. A basement lit by oil lamps. A circle of men shouting. 2 fighters in the ring. Bare fists. No rules. $2 to the winner. Cillian was 20. His opponent was Sean Doherty, 35, drunk, heavy-fisted. The fight was supposed to be 5 rounds. It lasted 2. In the second round, Doherty caught Cillian with a right hook that split his ear. Cillian came back with an uppercut that landed wrong, too hard, at the wrong angle, on the soft spot below the jaw. Doherty's head snapped back. He fell. He didn't get up. The crowd went quiet the way crowds go quiet when entertainment becomes emergency. Cillian stood over him, fists still raised, blood dripping from his ear, and watched a man die at his feet. He was 20 years old. The room smelled like sweat and lamp oil, and something else. The specific metallic smell of a life ending in a room where nobody knew the dead man's middle name. 3 years later, Abilene, Kansas. A saloon. A man named Polk recognized Cillian from the Bowery and wanted the reputation of cutting the man who'd killed Sean Doherty. Polk followed him into the alley. The knife came fast, a slash that opened Cillian's face from temple to jaw, a river of blood that blinded his left eye. Cillian grabbed Polk's wrist, twisted, and the knife went into Polk's ribs. Not intentionally, desperately, the way a drowning man grabs anything that floats. Polk died in the alley with his own knife in his chest. Cillian pressed his shirt against his face and walked to a horse doctor who stitched the wound for 50 cents and didn't ask questions. 2 dead men now, 2 ghosts, and a scar that ran down his face like a map to both of them. He told Sable about the ghosts on the 3rd night. Not because she asked, because she was sitting on the porch braiding leather for a halter, and the moonlight on her hands reminded him of his mother's hands working in the tenement, and the memory opened a door he usually kept bolted. "I've killed 2 men," he said. No preamble. The fact laid between them like a knife on a table. Sable's hands didn't stop braiding. Did they deserve it? The first one, maybe. The second one, yes. Do you deserve what happened after? I don't know. Then you're still deciding, she said. That's better than most men. Most men decided they were innocent a long time ago and stopped thinking about it. The braiding continued. The moon moved. And Cillian realized this woman had heard the worst thing about him and responded not with fear or judgment, but with a precision that cut closer to truth than anything a priest had ever said. But the ghosts weren't the only danger. In the saloon, the 40 rejected suitors had consolidated around one man, Harlan Goss. A bartender named Pruitt, wiping glasses, told it to a ranch hand who told it to the wind. Goss has been talking about Sable Arapahe since he was 15. Used to ride out here just to watch the ranch from the ridge. Drew pictures of her in a journal he thinks nobody knows about. Thought she was his. Nobody told him people aren't things until she did. Goss was not a simple villain. He was something worse. A man who had confused obsession with love and couldn't survive the correction. And Goss had a weapon. His father was a judge. Territorial law had a provision buried in the statutes. A choosing could be legally challenged if the selected husband was of demonstrated moral unfitness. 2 dead men in a drifter's past would qualify. Goss sent a telegram to New York. The reply would take 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, Cillian Vane would fall in love with a woman who'd chosen him for having nothing. Not knowing that the nothing he carried included 2 bodies that were about to be dug up by a man who'd been watching from a ridge since he was 15, and had decided that if he couldn't have her, the stranger who could would be destroyed. 2 weeks is not enough time to fall in love, but it's enough time to recognize it. Cillian worked the ranch because he didn't know how to be idle. He mended the fence along the south ridge that had been sagging since spring. He reshoed 4 horses in a single afternoon. He rebuilt the water trough with cedar planks. He milled himself from a dead tree behind the barn. He worked the way his mother had worked, relentlessly, silently, as if the quality of the labor was a form of speech. Magnus watched from the porch and said nothing, which in Magnus's language was as close to approval as a stranger could receive. Not approval of the man, approval of the work. The distinction mattered. Sable watched him from different distances, from the kitchen window while kneading bread, from the barn door while saddling her horse, from the porch at dusk while the sky turned old copper. She watched the way he moved, efficient, unhurried, the economy of a man who'd learned that wasted motion is wasted life. She watched his hands on the fence wire, careful, precise, the same hands that had killed 2 men in rooms that smelled like lamp oil and sweat, now building something instead of destroying. She didn't romanticize the violence. She filed it. A man who has taken life and chosen to build. Afterward is making a decision every day, and that decision is the most interesting thing about him. On the 9th night, they sat on the south ridge and watched the stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Sable told him about her mother, about Ailani's last words, about the cage of being chosen by men who wanted what you came with. Cillian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Your mother was right. A man with nothing can't hold anything over you." He paused. "But a man with nothing also can't give you much." Sable looked at him. "You rebuilt the water trough today. Cedar. Milled it yourself. That's just work. That's everything," she said. "Every man in that line would have hired someone. You did it yourself, because it needed doing, not because you were trying to impress me." She paused. "That's the most romantic thing that's ever happened on this ranch." Cillian almost smiled. His face wasn't built for it, or maybe it had forgotten how. But the almost smile was there, and Sable saw it, and she decided that making Cillian Vane almost smile was going to be the project of her life. It was a good project. It lasted longer than she expected, but not long enough. That night, after Sable went inside, Cillian sat on the ridge and looked at the stars and said to no one, to the 2 dead men, to the wind, "I don't deserve this." The stars said nothing, but they didn't disagree. Sometimes that's as close to absolution as a man gets. On the 12th day, a rider arrived from Cheyenne carrying an envelope addressed to Harlan Goss. Inside was a sworn affidavit from a New York City police detective confirming 2 deaths connected to Cillian Vane, one in 1876, one in 1879. The names were real. The ghosts had been given paper bodies. And Goss, reading the affidavit in the saloon with a whiskey in his hand, and a smile that was more wound than expression, said to the men around him, "Now we bury him." Not with shovels. With law. Goss filed the challenge on a Tuesday morning. The document was delivered to Magnus by a territorial deputy who apologized as he handed it over. The challenge cited Section 14 of the Wyoming Territorial Marriage Code. A choosing could be voided if the selected husband was of demonstrated moral unfitness as evidenced by criminal history, moral turpitude, or conduct unbecoming a lawful citizen. Attached was the New York affidavit. 2 deaths, 2 names. Magnus read it on the porch. Then he looked at Cillian in the yard and for the first time, the old man's face showed fear. Magnus called Sable inside. They stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Ailani had cooked for 22 years, where the turquoise beadwork on the curtains was Ailani's last handiwork. "You knew," Magnus said. "He told me," Sable said. "2 men. And you still chose him." "I chose him because he told me. A man who confesses before he's caught is not a man hiding. He's a man deciding to stop, running." Magnus was quiet. The clock ticked. "The hearing is in 1 week. If Goss wins, the choosing is voided. You'll have to choose again, from his line." "Then Goss won't win," Sable said. She spent 3 days in Casper at the Territorial Records Office. She read statutes until her eyes burned. She wasn't a lawyer. She was a rancher's daughter with a dead mother's voice in her chest and a fury that could have powered a locomotive. On the second day, she found it. Section 14 required that moral unfitness be demonstrated through conviction in a court of law. Not accusation, not affidavit. Conviction. The first death was ruled accidental by a coroner's inquest. The second man was a wanted criminal, and no charges were filed. Goss had paper. Sable had precedent. The battle would be fought with the difference between a fact and a verdict. She rode back and found Cillian packing his saddlebag. He was leaving. She saw it in his posture, the coiled readiness of a man who'd spent his life being the thing that moved on before it was moved along. "Don't," she said from the doorway. Cillian didn't look up. "The affidavit is real. Those men are dead because of me. Goss is right about what I am." "Goss is right about what you did. He's wrong about what you are." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "The difference is that what you did happened 7 years ago. What you are is the man who rebuilt my water trough because it needed doing. What you are is the man who told me the truth when lying would have been easier. What you are is the man I chose." She paused. "And I don't make mistakes." The line from the choosing, spoken again, not to a crowd, but to him. Cillian set down the saddlebag, not because he believed her, because he wanted to. And wanting to believe someone is the first step back from the edge of leaving. He stayed. The hearing was in 4 days, and in the barn at night, after Sable had gone inside, Cillian began a project he told no one about. Took a horseshoe nail from the tack box. Iron. Thick. Ordinary. He heated it in the forge behind the barn. He shaped it with a hammer, filed it with a rasp, bent it into a circle, and polished it until it shone like dark water. The same hands that had killed Sean Doherty in a Bowery basement. The same hands that had caught the knife scar in an Abilene alley. Now shaping something small and round and meant to be worn by the woman who'd looked past 40 men and pointed at him. He worked by lantern light for 4 nights. His fingers bled from the filing. He didn't stop. The hearing was held in Crow Hollow's church. Pews packed. Ranchers, suitors, townspeople. 2 reporters from Cheyenne. Judge Whitfield presided, not Goss's father, who'd recused himself, but a circuit judge from Laramie who smelled like pipe tobacco and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Goss sat at the front with his attorney Creel, a Cheyenne lawyer who treated human lives like line items. Sable sat opposite with Cillian beside her. No attorney. A stack of territorial statutes and her mother's turquoise beadwork at her collar and the kind of certainty that makes lawyers nervous. Creel presented the case. The affidavit. 2 deaths. The Bowery. Abilene. He painted Cillian as a violent drifter with blood on his hands and no business standing beside Crow Hollow's founding daughter. It was effective. The pews murmured. The reporters scribbled. Magnus gripped the edge of the pew. Cillian sat still. His hands, the hands that had rebuilt the trough, that had shaped an iron ring in secret, that had killed 2 men and chosen to build, were flat on his thighs, pressing down, holding himself in the chair. Sable stood. She didn't ask permission. Section 14 requires demonstrated moral unfitness through conviction, she said. Her voice carried to every corner. Mr. Vane has never been convicted of any crime. The first death was ruled accidental by a coroner's inquest. The second man was a wanted fugitive, and no charges were filed. Mr. Creel has presented an affidavit, not a conviction. The statute requires a conviction. Creel stood. The spirit of the law, the letter of the law, Sable interrupted, is what courts enforce, not the spirit. If the spirit were sufficient, half the men in this room would be morally unfit. Laughter from the pews. Creel reddened. Whitfield almost smiled. Goss stood. He hadn't planned to speak, but humiliation has a voice of its own. This isn't about the law, he said. This is about a woman who rejected every decent man in the territory for a killer with nothing to his name. She chose him to humiliate me, to humiliate all of us. The church went silent, the dangerous silence that precedes violence. Sable looked at Goss. She looked at him the way her mother had never been allowed to look at Magnus, directly, without apology. I didn't reject you to humiliate you, Harlan. I rejected you because when you looked at me, you saw a ranch. When he looked at me, he saw a woman he didn't even know he was allowed to want. She paused. I know about the journal. I know about the ridge. You've been watching me since you were 15. That's not love, Harlan. That's surveillance. And I will not be watched for the rest of my life by a man who can't tell the difference. The church gasped. Goss's face drained of color, not from the rejection, which he'd felt before, but from the exposure. She knew. She'd always known. And she'd chosen the stranger anyway. That was worse than being rejected. That was being seen and found insufficient. Judge Whitfield ruled in 90 seconds. Challenge dismissed. No conviction. No standing. Choosing valid. But he added a condition. Cillian Vane must remain in Crow Hollow for 1 year and demonstrate settled character before the marriage was finalized. A probationary period. Not a victory. A test. Goss walked out. The look on his face as he passed Cillian was not defeat. It was patience. The specific patience of a man who has 12 months to destroy what a courtroom couldn't. Cillian recognized the look. He'd worn it himself in a Bowery ring. And he knew. Goss was done with law. Whatever came next would not involve a courtroom. They were married on a Thursday, 6 months into the probationary year. Not in the church, on the South Ridge under the stars with Magnus officiating. The ceremony lasted 4 minutes. Sable wore her mother's turquoise beadwork. Cillian wore his faded denim shirt because it was the best thing he owned. Magnus said the words. Both said yes, and the stars leaned close. That night, Cillian placed a small wooden box on the kitchen table. Cedar, hand-carved, sanded smooth. He said nothing about it. He went to bed. At dawn, before he was awake, Sable came downstairs and saw the box. She opened it. Inside was a ring. Not gold, not silver. Iron. Forged from a horseshoe nail. Shaped and polished until it shone like dark water. Inside, the band, scratched in letters so small you needed lamplight to read them, were 3 words. I was found. She held the ring to the window. The morning light caught the letters. I was found. Not I found you. I was found. He hadn't chosen her. She had chosen him. And he knew. He'd been lost his entire life, drifting, fighting, killing, running. And on a dusty road in Crow Hollow, a woman had looked past 40 men and said, "I want him." And in that moment, for the first time in 27 years, he was found. Sable put the ring on her finger. Iron, a horseshoe nail, made by hands that had killed 2 men and built a water trough and shaped this circle by lantern light with bleeding fingers. She pressed the ring to her lips. Then she walked to the bedroom door and looked at Cillian sleeping. The scar on his face catching the early light, his hands open on the blanket, the hands that had made this thing. And she whispered, so quiet that only the room heard, "I want him." The same, 3 words, spoken for the second time, the first time to a crowd of 40 men, this time to a sleeping man who couldn't hear. Both times she meant it, but this time it meant more, because this time it wasn't defiance, it was devotion. 3 days later, Cillian rode to Casper for lumber to rebuild the barn's east wall. He told Sable he'd be back by nightfall. She stood on the porch and watched him ride south and felt something she'd never felt, the specific vulnerability of loving someone who leaves your line of sight. She looked at the iron ring on her finger. She waited. By dusk, the buckskin mare arrived at the edge of Crow Hollow, riderless, saddlebag still attached, lumber money gone. They found Cillian the next morning in a gully 2 miles off the main road, 2 broken ribs, shattered jaw, bullet wound in his left shoulder, beaten first, shot second, left third, not left for dead, left for found, because killing makes a martyr. Breaking a man and leaving him breathing makes a warning. Everyone knew who'd done it. No one could prove it. Goss had been in Cheyenne with 3 men who'd swear to it. Sable sat beside Cillian's bed for 9 days. She cleaned his wounds. She set his ribs with cotton strips. She fed him broth through a jaw wired shut. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. Every night, she took the iron ring from her finger and pressed it into his closed fist, curling his fingers around the band, so the first thing he felt each time consciousness flickered was the ring he'd made. The words, "I was found," pressing into his palm like a heartbeat made of iron. On the 4th night, his fingers tightened around it. On the 7th, his eyes opened. His jaw was wired. He couldn't speak, but his hand found hers on the blanket and placed the ring back on her finger. 2 motions in the dark. She gave him the ring each night. He returned it each morning. A conversation without words. A marriage conducted in iron and silence. And on the 9th night, Sable leaned close to his ear and whispered, "I want him." The 3rd time. The final time. Spoken not to a crowd, not to a sleeping man, but to a broken one. And the 3 words, the same 3 words from the choosing, from the bedroom door, from the bedside, completed their arc, from defiance to devotion to war. Cillian healed. Not fast. The jaw took 3 months, the ribs 2, the shoulder never fully straightened. He'd carry the bullet wound the way he carried the scar, as geography, as evidence, as the price of being alive. He went back to work before the doctors said he should. He mended the barn wall he'd been riding to fix. He built a new gate. He sanded a rocking chair from mesquite wood and placed it beside Sable's on the porch. 2 chairs, side by side, the most domestic thing a former Bowery fighter had ever built. And Goss was never charged, but the valley delivered its own verdict. Within a year, every rancher in Crow Hollow stopped doing business with the Goss family. Supplies weren't sold. Cattle weren't purchased. Hands wouldn't hire on. The silence was total and coordinated. Goss's father resigned his judgeship and moved to Denver. Goss himself left Wyoming and was never seen in Crow Hollow again. Not disappeared, erased, the way the frontier erases men who mistake power for permission, not with violence, with absence. Years later, the people of Crow Hollow would know the Vane Ranch as the place with 2 rocking chairs on the porch and a cedar water trough, and a barn wall rebuilt 3 times because the man who lived there refused to let anything stay broken. They'd know the woman, dark-haired, turquoise at her collar, who made decisions the way lightning makes contact. They'd know the man, scarred, quiet, jaw that clicked when he chewed, shoulder that predicted rain, hands that built everything and held nothing over anyone. They'd tell the story, how she rejected 40 warriors and pointed at a stranger, but they'd tell it wrong. They'd say she was wild, defiant. They'd miss the truth. She chose him because a dying mother said, "Find a man with nothing." Because nothing is the only material you can build a life from without it becoming a cage. And Cillian Vane, who'd spent 27 years being nothing to everyone, became everything to one woman. And that was enough. That was always enough. And the iron ring stayed on her finger for the rest of her life, through the healing and the rocking chairs and the years of cedar troughs and straight fences. An iron ring, a horseshoe nail. 3 words scratched inside that nobody could see unless they looked. I was found, the cheapest ring in Wyoming Territory, made by the same scarred hands that had once taken life and had chosen, finally, to make something instead. And it held nothing over her. And it told her, every morning when the light caught it, that the stranger she'd pointed at on the road had known what her mother meant. That nothing is the only material. You can build a love from that doesn't become a cage. And the ring is still there, on a hand that's been in the ground for decades, in a grave beside a man with 2 scars and no regrets, under a sky that still leans close. Listening. If this story stayed with you, if the iron ring or the rocking chairs or the words "I was found" are sitting in your chest right now, leave a like and subscribe to Wild West Talehouse. The frontier still has stories, and the best ones are about the people who were found by someone who wasn't even looking.